In the quiet solitude of his small apartment, the faint hum of the television barely disturbed the pre-dawn stillness of a Friday morning. Marcus Freeman, now 42, sat alone, the glow of the screen reflecting in his weary eyes. He was in a small town nestled near the Ozark Mountains, Arkansas, a place that held both the lingering echoes of his childhood and the gaping void of a profound loss. With a sigh, he reached for the remote, idly flipping through channels. Faces flickered by, an endless parade of early morning programming, until he paused on a religious broadcast. A preacher, bathed in the soft glow of stained glass windows, delivered a sermon, hymns playing softly in the background. A bitter ache settled in Marcus's chest. The passionate words, the familiar setting, it all painfully reminded him of his father, Reverend Elijah Freeman. 25 years. 25 years since his father had vanished without a trace, a silence that had hollowed out Marcus's faith and hope, leaving behind only the cold ashes of speculation. He turned away from the screen, unable to face the prayers and sermons that once brought him solace. Just then, the shrill ring of the phone pierced the quiet. Marcus moved to the kitchen, a flicker of surprise crossing his face as he recognized the voice on the other end, a voice he hadn't heard in decades. "Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller. We're calling to let you know we have found something related to your father's case." Marcus frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "Is this some kind of joke? I don't have time for this. That case is ancient history. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Freeman," Detective Miller replied, her voice calm and steady. "But I can assure you this is not a fake call. Just this morning in the forest, a logger found a vintage Adidas bag containing a pastoral robe and a Bible with your father's name." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "Evidence? After all these years? A Bible with my father's name?" he whispered, almost to himself. "Yes, sir. We'd like you to come to the location to identify these items. I'm sending officers to pick you up now, if that's all right." "Of course," Marcus said, his voice a strained whisper, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'll be ready." After hanging up, he moved quickly, pulling on clothes, his mind racing with a whirlwind of possibilities. As he passed through the living room, he glanced at the church program still playing on the TV, a pang of guilt seizing him for his bitter thoughts moments ago. He had once been a devout young man, steeped in faith under his father's gentle guidance. But the disappearance had shattered it all, leaving him adrift in a sea of doubt. The police arrived, and he turned off the television, the screen going black, a mirror to the questions churning within him. He followed the officers to their car. The drive was mostly silent, the cruiser cutting through the early morning mist as they headed out of town. It was about 15 minutes from the small town, and as they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their shadows long and imposing. Marcus wondered about the isolation of their destination, how a bag, seemingly so ordinary, could have ended up buried so far from civilization. Upon arrival, the scene was a hive of activity. Police and workers crowded the area, yellow tape a stark line against the green foliage. Officers photographed a massive tree stump and the surrounding soil, their flashes momentarily illuminating the damp earth. Detective Sarah Miller, a woman in her early 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a professional demeanor, greeted him. "Mr. Freeman, thank you for coming. This is Tom Jenkins, the logger who discovered the bag." Tom, a burly man with weathered features, stepped forward, extending a calloused hand. "Morning. Sorry about the circumstances." Marcus shook his hand, his grip firm. "Can you tell me how you found it?" Tom nodded, gesturing toward the imposing tree stump. "Me and my colleague were clearing this area of the forest when I noticed something off about this stump. I started digging with a shovel, excavators are too big to bring this deep in, and eventually found this vintage Adidas bag buried underneath. When I opened it and saw the Bible and robe, I knew it wasn't something that should be out here, so I called the police." Marcus approached the bag, which the police had carefully laid on the ground. He stared at the stump first, his mind struggling to process the impossible. How did the bag end up here, under a tree stump? The logger scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Based on what I can tell, someone cut down this tree a long time ago, dug a hole beneath the stump, and buried the bag underground. He pointed, illustrating how the tree stump had naturally hollowed out by rot. See how the stump is rotted? Makes it easier to dig under. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Detective Miller nodded, addressing her officers. We should examine the evidence and contents of the bag. Mr. Freeman, we need you to help identify these items. They moved to a small tent that had been set up nearby. Marcus followed them inside, where the bag was carefully placed on a folding table. Police officers, their hands encased in gloves, opened it. The Bible was removed first, mostly stuck together for moisture, but remarkably preserved by the bag, allowing them to still read parts of it. On the front page, in the top corner, Marcus immediately recognized his father's name, written in the familiar hand he had known since childhood. That's my father's handwriting, he said softly, a wave of bittersweet memories washing over him. One of the officers carefully turned to the last page, where a personal note was tucked inside. It appeared to be some kind of daily prayer, but as Marcus read it, his breath hitched. It wasn't just a normal prayer. The words spoke of a plea to God to stop suffering, asking why there was so much evil in the world, and for help to win against people who tried to get me away from God. Marcus's throat tightened. That's definitely my father's handwriting. It's distinct and deep. I remember it clearly from when he taught me about Christianity in his study. Next, they examined the robe. Detective Miller handled it carefully. We know it's been buried since 1977, but now we have access to DNA testing. Because we're in a small, rural town, we'll need to send the evidence to state or federal labs due to equipment limitations here. Marcus inspected the robe, running his fingers over the rough fabric. I think this was indeed my father's. The size is right. He looked up at the detective, a troubling thought forming. Do you think someone did this to my dad? Killed him? Detective Miller inspected the robe again, her gaze thoughtful. There's no apparent trace of blood here. If someone had killed your father and hidden these items, we would typically see evidence suggesting homicide. But all evidence from the past showed no leads pointing to murder. She looked at him sympathetically. Perhaps your father was a troubled man and took his own life, or just disappeared, leaving his identity as a pastor behind and burying it in these woods. Marcus shook his head firmly. No. My father was no coward. He would never have done this. And if he just wanted to get away, either by running away or suicide, why would he travel so deep into this forest just to bury the bag? He paused, looking at the Adidas bag with a critical eye. I never saw my father own this bag. He was a simple man. He wouldn't have bought something like this. Tom Jenkins nodded in agreement. It's not a quick task to dig underground this deep and bury a bag this size, especially under a tree. Just look at the size of those tree roots. Even in its decayed state, it would take a single man working alone a great deal of effort and a long time to finish the job. Detective Miller considered this, her expression unreadable. We'll keep all this in mind. Were there people in the community, either in town or at your father's church, who didn't like him? Marcus sighed heavily. What can you expect? This is the Ozarks, and back then, racial tensions were very real in this small religious town. My father was a faithful minister, though, and he never would have wronged anyone intentionally. The detective nodded. We'll review the case and evidence from the past again. For now, we'll keep our options open. As police secured the evidence, Marcus asked if they could send him photographs of what they found. An officer explained that once processed, they would provide copies of all documentation and evidence photos. Detective Miller then permitted Marcus to return home, turning to speak with Tom Jenkins about limitations on their work in the area now that it was an investigation site. An officer escorted Marcus back to where the car was parked, and they began the drive back to town. When Marcus reached his apartment, instead of going inside, he headed straight to his father's study. The modest house where he grew up had long since been sold, but Marcus had kept his father's most personal belongings, including the contents of his study, which he had set up in a spare room of his apartment. He began to look at the shelves first, searching for his father's sermon notes. He collected them carefully, His father had kept a very neat collection, all arranged on the shelf. Even now, they were gathering dust but remained well preserved despite the yellowing pages. Marcus thought about how young he had been back then, when he first went through these sermon notes. He was 15 years old when he began his intensive study under his father's guidance. Now, at 42, he could only remember fragments of those teachings. He wanted to read these sermon collections again, to refresh his memories of his father's teachings, but mainly he wanted to convince himself that his father was a true devotee who didn't take his own life or struggle with his calling or identity. Something else must have happened. As he collected the volumes of his father's sermon notebooks, he noticed that the volume from 1977, the year his father disappeared, was missing. He searched everywhere for it, including his father's bedroom, but he didn't find it. Instead, in one of the cabinets close to his father's bed, Marcus found another collection of his father's personal diaries, but they too were only from the years before 1977. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, thinking. If his father was so diligent and kept all records, why weren't the 1977 sermon notes and diary here at home? Perhaps he had kept them at the church where he served as a full-timer back then. Marcus thought back to the day he moved his father's belongings from their home. He had been so shaken and upset at the time that he hadn't paid much attention to the collection or the volumes. Marcus tidied up the study room, selected an older edition of the sermon notebook to bring with him for reference, and headed to his car. He was going to visit Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church for the first time in 25 years. As he drove, Marcus remembered how his father had spoken with such passion during his sermons, how his voice had filled the church with warmth and conviction. The memory was painful, but for the first time in years, Marcus didn't try to push it away. Instead, he let it wash over him, remembering the man who had raised him, strong, principled, and devoted to his calling. The drive to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church didn't take too long. He arrived there in 10 minutes. The church building looked much older now than he remembered 25 years ago. When he was still 17 years old, the church had looked grand and new back then. He drew a long breath before he entered the church, never thinking that he would visit a church again after all these years, especially the same church where his father had worked. He pushed the door and entered. The interior was pretty much the same. The wood pews gleamed with polish, the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the floor, and the pulpit stood at the front, commanding and dignified. Marcus walked inside and approached an elderly man standing near the altar. The man turned and smiled warmly. "May I help you, son?" "I hope so," Marcus replied. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The man humbly introduced himself as Pastor Harold Whitmore and asked what brought him there. Marcus was immediately familiar with the name. He had seen this man countless times 25 years ago, though he looked much older now. He knew Pastor Harold was the owner and the main pastor of the church who had worked with his father. Marcus introduced himself and said he was Marcus Freeman, son of Reverend Elijah Freeman. Pastor Harold was shocked at first, clearly not recognizing the grown man standing before him. Then his face transformed with joy. "Marcus! My goodness, is it really you? We haven't seen you since." His voice trailed off. "Since my father disappeared," Marcus finished for him. 25 years ago." Pastor Harold nodded solemnly. "How are you doing these days? We've missed you around here." "My faith was really tested by that incident," Marcus admitted, his gaze drifting to the altar. "Even now, it's hard for me to accept God." Pastor Harold nodded in understanding. Just then, they heard the back door open, and another elderly man walked in. Pastor Harold called out, "Reverend George Langston, look who's here." Reverend George, another church elder, approached them. Both men were delighted and surprised to see Marcus. They asked what brought him back after all these years. Marcus explained about the discovery in the dense forest, and how police suspected his father might have taken his own life or abandoned his ministry. "I'm seeking guidance," Marcus said, looking from one man to the other. "Do you think my father would have really taken his own life or abandoned his ministry? You both worked closely with him." Pastor Harold and Reverend George were both speechless at first. They exchanged glances and appeared uncomfortable. "Your father was always known as a gentleman," Pastor Harold finally said, his voice slow and measured. "A faithful servant of the Lord, filled with wisdom and courage. But no one knows the deepest thoughts of a man's heart," Reverend George added quietly, his eyes avoiding Marcus's gaze. "Why do you ask these questions now?" Pastor Harold inquired, a hint of suspicion in his tone. Marcus explained that with the new evidence, the police had reopened the case. If they could find his body, they might be able to determine the cause of his. He swallowed hard, the word death catching in his throat. "Technology has come a long way since then. DNA testing and forensic methods are much more advanced now." Harold and George exchanged another glance. "We would never think of your father as a troubled man," Harold said slowly. "But in the last days before he was gone, we noticed he had spent more late hours in his office at the church, often praying in anguish. When anyone asked him about it," George added, "he would say he was doing deep devotion and prayers." Marcus nodded, then told them his real intention for visiting. "I'm looking for the missing volume of my father's Sunday sermon notes, and his personal diary for the year 1977. He showed them the older volume he had brought with him from home. It should look something like this. Dad kept his records using the same brand of notebook up until that year, but the 1977 volume is missing. His personal diary from that year is gone too, though I have all the others at home." Harold and George examined the notebook Marcus had brought. "We never really saw these," Harold said, his brow furrowed. "If we had, we would have given them to you or the police back then." "Let's have a look anyway," George suggested, a sudden eagerness in his voice. They went to the church office, which had once been his father's but was now used by Reverend George. They checked the bookshelves and cabinets but found nothing. Then they decided to check the library too, spending almost an hour searching through shelves, drawers, and storage boxes. As they searched, Marcus placed his reference notebook on a library table, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The search yielded nothing. No trace of the missing volumes could be found. In the end, Marcus thanked them and apologized for troubling them. "I appreciate your help, even if we didn't find anything." Before leaving, Marcus knelt at one of the pews and prayed, feeling awkward toward God after so long. "If you're really alive and rose from the dead 2,000 years ago, guide me to at least know what happened to my dad." Then he walked out of the church and went back to his car, unaware that in his haste and distraction he had left his father's old sermon notebook behind on the library table. As he was driving home, Marcus was deep in thought. He still hadn't realized he'd forgotten his father's notebook at the church. Instead, his mind was fixed on the pastor's words about his father's last days, how he spent most of his time at church in deep prayer and devotion, groaning in what sounded like spiritual anguish. Could it be that his father had indeed taken his own life or abandoned his life and ministry? Maybe it was because of his mother. She had passed away in 1976, a year before his father's disappearance, and it had hit both of them hard. The grief had been crushing, especially for his father. Marcus made a sudden decision. Instead of going home, he turned his car toward the cemetery where his mother was buried. It wasn't too far from town, just at the outskirts. He stopped at a flower shop across the street from the cemetery and bought a modest bouquet. The shopkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, wrapped the flowers carefully. "Special occasion?" she asked. "Just visiting my mother," Marcus replied. "It's been too long." The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon. Rows of headstones stretched across the well-maintained grounds, shaded by ancient oak trees. Marcus walked slowly along the familiar path to his mother's grave, memories washing over him with each step. He found her headstone, Sarah Freeman, beloved wife and mother, and gently laid the flowers before it. Then he sat on the grass, the way he used to as a teenager after both his parents were gone. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "It's been a while." He told her about the discovery in the forest, about the Bible and the robe, about his visit to the church. He spoke as if she could hear him, finding comfort in the one-sided conversation. I don't know what happened to Dad, he admitted. All these years I'd been angry at him, at God, at everything. But now I just want to know the truth. As he sat there, Marcus suddenly heard the sound of someone crying. It sounded like a little boy. He got up and walked toward the source of the sound, finding a young boy sitting and leaning against a tree a few rows away. Hey there, Marcus said gently, approaching slowly so as not to frighten the child. Are you okay? The boy looked up, his face streaked with tears. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. What's your name? Marcus asked. The boy sniffled. Robbie. Robbie, where are your parents? Robbie didn't answer at first, then pointed to a nearby grave. Marcus's heart sank. Is someone with you? A guardian? Robbie didn't answer. Marcus looked concerned. I can help drive you home if you need. Please, not home, the boy said, his voice quivering. They don't like me there. My aunt and uncle. The words struck a chord with Marcus. After his mother's death and his father's disappearance, he had lived with his uncle and aunt, who had made it clear they considered him a burden. I understand, Marcus said softly. I'll stay with you for a while, but eventually you'll need to go home. Your family will be looking for you. He reached out to comfort the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. Immediately he felt heat radiating through the child's thin jacket. Robbie, you're burning up, Marcus said, alarmed. You have a fever. I need to get you home or to a doctor. I can't just leave you here alone. Please, not home. The boy pleaded again. Can you take me to your home? Marcus shook his head. I can't do that, or I'll get in trouble. How about the hospital? You need medical attention. The boy's face scrunched up with fear. Can you take me to a church instead? The hospital would be better, Marcus insisted. They can give you medicine for your fever. When my mom was alive, Robbie said, his voice small, whenever I was sick she would go to church and ask the pastor for the take-home Holy Communion. She would give it to me and pray over it, and I would get better. Marcus's breath caught. He knew it well. His father, as a pastor, had given those take-home Holy Communions for family members who couldn't attend Sunday service or were sick. He had helped him prepare them back then. I know about that, Marcus said. My father was a pastor at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. He used to give those to sick people. He made a decision. Here's what we'll do. If you agree to go to the hospital with me, I'll get you the Holy Communion from the church and bring it to you there. We can take it together. How does that sound? After a moment's hesitation, the boy nodded. As they walked to his car, Marcus suddenly realized he hadn't seen his father's notebook since leaving the church. With a sinking feeling, he remembered placing it on the library table and never picking it up again. I left my book at the church, he muttered to himself. I'll have to go back for it later. Marcus drove Robbie to the emergency room and explained the situation to the medical team. He wasn't sure of the boy's address but thought they might find it in their records. Before Robbie was taken away by the medical team, the boy looked at Marcus. You promised about the communion. I'll keep that promise, Marcus assured him. I'll be back soon. After completing the necessary paperwork and arranging to pay for the boy's treatment, Marcus left the hospital. The sky had darkened to a late afternoon when he stepped outside. He got back to his car and searched for the church's phone number in his contacts list. It was the old number he had always kept, just in case. He tried calling to ask about the Holy Communion, but no one answered. He decided to drive there directly. He arrived at the church and parked his car in the lot, entering the building again. Marcus searched for Pastor Harold or Reverend George but couldn't find either of them. Instead, a young church staff member greeted him, clearly not recognizing who Marcus was. Can I help you, sir? The young man asked. I'm looking for Pastor Harold or Reverend George, Marcus replied. Are they around? The young staff member shook his head. They're at the church cemetery right now, performing blessings. Marcus frowned. This didn't sound like any ritual he recognized from his years at the church. Pastors didn't typically perform cemetery blessings, especially not at this hour. Is that usual? He asked. The young man shrugged. Sometimes they do that. It's been like that since I started serving here. But I can help you with something if you'd like. Marcus explained about his missing book and the take-home Holy Communion. I was here earlier today talking with Pastor Harold and Reverend George, but I left my book in the library. Also, I need a take-home Holy Communion for a sick boy in the hospital. The young staff member seemed to believe him without question. I can help you with both. Let's check the library first. They walked to the church library, and Marcus was relieved to see his book still on the table where he had left it. He picked it up, noticing that the piles of books from their earlier search had been neatly returned to the shelves. As he glanced around the library one last time, he noticed a book on the top shelf that appeared to have been recently disturbed. It wasn't pushed in properly, teetering dangerously close to the edge. I should fix that before it falls and hurts someone, Marcus said, reaching up. The young staff member started to protest, saying he would take care of it later, but Marcus was already stretching to reach it. Being tall, Marcus easily grasped the book, but it was unexpectedly heavy. It slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a thud, pages splaying open. I'm sorry, Marcus said, bending to retrieve it. As he picked it up, he noticed the title, Church Financial Management and Stewardship. What caught his eye, however, was the familiar handwriting in the margins, his father's handwriting. Is this book available to borrow? Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The staff member looked uncertain. We need to check it out properly if you want to borrow it. Of course. After the young man recorded the loan in the church library log book, they exited the library. The staff member then asked Marcus to wait while he fetched the communion from the sacristy. May I come with you? Marcus asked. I used to help in the sacristy when my father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, served here. The young man looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, sir. I've heard about Reverend Elijah Freeman, but we can't let anyone into the sacristy. Marcus nodded in understanding. Of course. He waited in the hall, opening the financial book he had borrowed. There were numerous passages highlighted and annotated in his father's distinctive handwriting. One section was particularly heavily marked. God sees how we handle his money, followed by an urgent note. This isn't just bookkeeping, it's about trust and integrity. Church funds are sacred trusts, and leaders must be beyond reproach in their handling of these resources. In the margin, his father had written, accountability to God first, then to the congregation. As Marcus turned the pages, he noticed something else, what appeared to be the faint impressions of erased pencil marks. His father had always pressed hard when writing with pencil, leaving deep indentations in the paper. Tilting the page to catch the light, Marcus could make out two names that had been circled and then erased, Harold Whitmore and George Langston, both with question marks beside them. Several sentences about church fund embezzlement were heavily underlined, with notes about dealing with financial impropriety in Christian ways and with grace but firmness. Marcus closed the book, his mind racing. Had his father suspected Pastor Harold and Reverend George of financial misconduct? Is that why he had written their names? From the side window, Marcus caught sight of two silhouettes at the cemetery. He assumed they were Pastor Harold and Reverend George. He watched them through the window, trying to make out what they were doing in the dimming evening light. The young staff member returned with the take-home communion set in a small cloth bag. Here you are, sir. Thank you, Marcus said, accepting it gratefully. By the way, do you know exactly what Pastor Harold and Reverend George are doing at the cemetery? I can see them from here. The staff member glanced out the window. Just blessing the graves, as I mentioned. They should be finishing up soon. I was in the cellar cleaning before you came, so I'm not entirely sure when they started. Marcus nodded again, thanked him for his help, and left the church, his father's sermon notebook and the borrowed book tucked under one arm, the communion set in his hand. As he stepped outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church was hiding a secret. Outside the church, Marcus initially headed toward his car, but then decided to greet Pastor Harold and Reverend George before leaving. He wanted to thank them again for their help earlier, and perhaps gauge their reactions to his return visit. He walked toward the cemetery, which was separated from the church by a small grassy area. As he got closer, he began to make out more details in the fading evening light. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. Reverend George was shoveling soil onto a mound while Pastor Harold stood nearby, holding what appeared to be a bag. Neither man noticed Marcus approaching. "Good evening," Marcus called out, deliberately making his presence known before getting too close. Both men jerked their heads up, clearly startled. In the dim light, their faces showed unmistakable shock when they recognized Marcus. "Marcus!" Pastor Harold's voice was higher than usual. "What are you doing back here?" "I apologize for surprising you," Marcus said, walking closer. "I came back to get my book that I left in the library and to pick up a take-home communion for a sick child at the hospital." He gestured toward the shovel in George's hand. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" The two men exchanged quick glances. Pastor Harold cleared his throat. "We were just," he began, "blessing the graveyard." Reverend George cut in, his voice unusually strained. "When we noticed this old grave for a deceased dog from the congregation." Pastor Harold nodded vigorously. "Yes, and we got permission from the owner to move the remains because, as you can see, the church cemetery space is becoming crowded. We need to make room for future burials." Marcus looked from one man to the other, then at the freshly disturbed soil. Their explanation struck him as bizarre and implausible. Moving a pet's grave, making room in a cemetery, at this hour? But he didn't challenge them directly. "I see. Sorry for disturbing you. I just wanted to let you know I had come back for my book." Pastor Harold's eyes fixed on the financial book under Marcus's arm. "Is that another book you took from the library?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, it fell from the top shelf while I was there. I noticed my father's handwriting inside and decided to borrow it. The young staff member helped me check it out properly." Reverend George's posture stiffened visibly. After a moment of silence, he said, "Your father was once interested in that book too. Just remember to return it on Sunday." "Of course," Marcus replied. "I should go now. I promised the boy at the hospital I'd bring him communion." He excused himself and walked back to his car, feeling the men's eyes on his back the entire way. Once inside his vehicle, he watched through the window as Pastor Harold and Reverend George remained standing in the same spot, heads close together in what appeared to be intense discussion. Their body language was tense, nothing like the calm demeanor of men performing routine cemetery maintenance. Marcus started the engine but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, he continued watching them, his suspicions growing by the minute. He was about to leave when his phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Freeman, this is Nurse Jenkins from County General. The boy you brought in is asking for you. His family has arrived as well." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "Please tell him I'm on my way back." As he was about to pull out of the parking lot, movement caught his eye. Reverend George was loading the shovel and a bag into the back of his car, which was parked at the other side of the cemetery under a streetlight. The Reverend climbed into his vehicle and quickly drove away, exiting the cemetery from another access point. Pastor Harold, meanwhile, hurried back toward the church through the rear door. Marcus decided to head to the hospital immediately. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned in the direction of the county hospital, his mind working overtime to process what he had just witnessed. After driving for several minutes, as he approached a traffic light near the hospital, he spotted Reverend George's car again. The Reverend sped through the intersection just as the light turned yellow, taking the road that led toward the forest and mountains. Marcus frowned. That road didn't lead to any residential areas. It only went to the wilderness areas and mountain roads. Why would Reverend George be heading there at this hour with a shovel and a mysterious bag he claimed contained soil or animal remains from the church graveyard? Making a split-second decision, Marcus turned to follow the Reverend's car, maintaining a safe distance. He felt bad about delaying his visit to the boy, but his instincts told him something significant was happening. The Reverend's car sped up even more as it entered the forest road. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Detective Miller. "Detective, it's Marcus Freeman." "Mr. Freeman, is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," Marcus replied, keeping his eyes on the taillights ahead. I'm following Reverend George Langston from Mount Olive Church. He was digging in the church cemetery this evening, claimed he was relocating a dog's grave. Now he's speeding toward the forest with a shovel and a bag of what he says are remains. His behavior is extremely suspicious. There was a brief silence on the line before Detective Miller spoke again. Don't pursue him, Mr. Freeman. Turn back now. We'll handle this. I can't just let him out of my sight, Marcus argued. He could be in danger, or doing something tied to my father's case. I have reason to believe that could be what's going on. Yes, I know it's confusing, but I won't turn back until your officers catch up to us. Detective Miller sighed audibly. If you insist on continuing, maintain a safe distance, and do not engage with him under any circumstances. Keep this line open and tell me exactly where you are and what you see. I'm sending officers your way now. Understood? Marcus agreed, gripping the steering wheel tighter as he followed the Reverend's car deeper into the darkening forest. Marcus kept following the Reverend's car while keeping the line open with Detective Miller, reporting his location and observations. We're on Mountain View Road now, Marcus said, heading northeast, about 5 miles from the town limits. As he drove, he shared what he had discovered at the church, the book with his father's erased handwriting, the notes about financial misconduct, the strange behavior of the pastor and reverend. Questions were piling up. Who had erased his father's handwriting? Who had placed the book on that top shelf, and why did it appear recently disturbed? Had Pastor Harold or Reverend George checked it after his first visit to the church? The road is narrowing, Marcus reported. We're climbing in elevation now. There's nothing out here but wilderness and a few lookout points. Our officers are about 10 minutes behind you, Detective Miller replied. Remember, do not approach him. Suddenly, the Reverend's brake lights flashed, and the car pulled into a small gravel area, a scenic lookout point that offered views of the valley and river below. He's stopping at Eagle Point Lookout, Marcus said into the phone. I'm going to pull over at a distance. Marcus parked his car about 100 yards back, partially concealed by a bend in the road. From there, he could see Reverend George exit his vehicle, put on a headlamp, and remove the plastic bag and shovel from his trunk. The Reverend walked toward the guardrail, then descended a set of wooden stairs that led to a lower viewing platform and trail along the cliff edge. He's heading down to the lower trail with the bag and shovel, Marcus whispered into the phone. It's dangerous down there in the dark. The trail runs along the cliff edge with a steep drop to the river below. I'm not sure what he's planning to do. Stay in your car, Mr. Freeman, Detective Miller ordered. Officers are almost there. But as Marcus watched the Reverend's headlamp bobbing down the darkening trail, a surge of urgency overwhelmed him. The only reason George would head to the lower platform was to get as close as possible to the cliff's edge, and with a bag and shovel in hand, the most logical conclusion was that he intended to dispose of something, whatever it was in the bag, by throwing it into the chasm below. I need to know what he's doing, what's in that bag, and what he plans to do with it, Marcus said, his voice resolute. I'm going to try to stall him until your officers get here. Ignoring Detective Miller's protests, Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his glove compartment and quietly exited his car. He moved swiftly but cautiously toward the lookout point, following the beam of the Reverend's headlamp down the wooden stairs. Reverend George! Marcus called out when he reached the lower platform. The Reverend spun around, his headlamp momentarily blinding Marcus. When the light shifted, Marcus could see the shock and anger on the older man's face. What are you doing here? George demanded, his voice raspy. Have you been following me? I saw you speeding out of town and got concerned, Marcus said, moving carefully along the trail toward him. It's dangerous out here at night. What are you doing with that bag? You said it contained remains from the church cemetery. The Reverend didn't answer. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of the river far below. You know, don't you? Reverend George finally said, his voice low and tense. Marcus was still confused, the puzzle pieces not quite fitting together in his mind. No, what? Do not pretend, the Reverend snapped. The wail of police sirens suddenly cut through the night air. Reverend George's eyes widened. You called the police? He gasped. The plastic bag dropped from his hand, landing with a thud on the wooden trail. As it hit the ground, something solid inside made a distinct noise that soil or animal remains wouldn't make. Taking advantage of the Reverend's shock, Marcus lunged forward and grabbed the bag. Looking inside, he saw it contained not only soil from the grave but also 2 books covered in grave dust. Even in the dim light, he recognized them immediately by their covers: his father's sermon notebook from 1977 and his personal diary, the exact matches to the other volumes he had at home. You hid these from me? Marcus asked, anger rising in his chest. You wanted to get rid of them. He looked from the bag to the agitated Reverend. And those weren't dog remains at the cemetery, were they? They were my father's, weren't they? You were going to throw his remains off this cliff into the river below with the rest of the evidence. Police cars pulled into the lookout area, their flashing lights illuminating the scene in pulses of red and blue. Detective Miller's voice called down from above. Police! Stay where you are! Reverend George looked wildly from Marcus to the approaching officers. With a sudden movement, he climbed over the safety fence that separated the trail from the cliff edge. No! Marcus shouted, dropping the bag and rushing forward. Don't do this! This is better than facing arrest and shame. The Reverend muttered, preparing to jump. Marcus grabbed for him but missed as Reverend George leaned forward into the abyss. 2 officers who had raced down the stairs lunged forward and caught his arms, pulling him back despite his struggles and pleas to let him go. You won't meet your God's judgment so fast, one officer said as they dragged him back over the fence. You'll face the judgment of the world first. Detective Miller radioed for backup to arrest Pastor Harold at the church, suspecting he was also involved. Officers secured the scene, collecting the bag and its contents as evidence. Reverend George was read his rights and placed in a police car. Detective Miller approached Marcus, who was still shaking from the confrontation. I told you not to approach him, she said sternly, but her expression softened, seeing his distress. But I understand why you did. We need you to come to the station to identify these items properly. Marcus nodded, still processing what had just happened. He would have thrown my father's ashes and remains away if I hadn't been here. He paused, then after he calmed himself, he added, I have one favor to ask. Could someone call the hospital and let the nurse know I'll be late visiting the boy? I promised I'd return with the communion. We'll make sure they get the message, Detective Miller assured him. As they climbed back up to the parking area, Marcus looked back at the cliff edge, thinking how close they had come to losing critical evidence, and perhaps the final answers about what had happened to his father 25 years ago. They drove back to the police station, Marcus following the police cars. At the station, he saw Reverend George being processed for booking, and to his surprise, Pastor Harold was already there in handcuffs as well, being led to a holding cell. Detective Miller took Marcus to a conference room where the evidence was being carefully laid out on a table. The 2 books, the 1977 sermon notebook and his father's personal diary, the church finance textbook Marcus had borrowed, the grave soil which contained bone fragments, and what appeared to be part of a human skull, and the shovel. Marcus stared at the bone fragments in horror. Is that? We believe these are your father's remains, Detective Miller said gently. We'll need to confirm with DNA testing. Of course. Marcus felt lightheaded but managed to stay composed. What happens now? We need your statement about what you've observed today, and we'll need you to formally identify these items as potentially belonging to your father. For the next hour, Marcus gave his statement, recounting everything from the morning's call about the discovery in the forest to the confrontation at Eagle Point Lookout. He explained his suspicions about financial impropriety at the church based on the notes in the finance book. Meanwhile, forensic technicians were carefully examining the evidence. One officer approached with the personal diary, handling it with extreme care. This has suffered major damage, the technician explained. The leather cover has severe deterioration, cracked and rotted from years underground. The paper inside has swelled and stuck together into a solid, pulpy block in many places. There's extensive mold and mildew damage, turning sections black. It's extremely fragile. Can you read any of it? Detective Miller asked. It's a miracle it's not completely gone, the technician replied. We're handling it delicately, but we can make out some faint handwriting among the broken and rotted pages. Using specialized tools, they carefully separated a few pages that were less damaged. Marcus leaned in to see his father's handwriting, faded but still discernible. Cannot ignore this any longer. The missing funds are now over $10,000. When confronted privately, Harold and George denied everything, but the evidence is undeniable. I've prayed for guidance on how to proceed without publicly shaming them, but they must be held accountable. I have to say it again, it's honestly a miracle this page survived in such condition, one officer remarked. And the fact that the finance book was just sitting there on the top shelf of the church library, Harold or George must have thought it was safe, especially after erasing their names from the page. This really feels like divine intervention. They might have buried these books later than the body, another suggested. Otherwise, they would be totally unrecognizable by now. They turned to the sermon notebook next, which was in considerably better condition. This was likely kept in the church all these years, Detective Miller theorized. Probably stored somewhere dry until recently when they decided to dispose of it. The notebook contained Reverend Elijah Freeman's Sunday sermons from January through April 1977. In the weeks before his disappearance, his topics had increasingly focused on honesty, integrity, redemption, and forgiveness. One sermon, outlined from early April 1977, was titled, "The Courage to Confront Evil with Love," based on Matthew 18 verses 15 to 17. Marcus read his father's notes. When we see wrongdoing, especially within the church, we have a responsibility to address it with both truth and grace, first privately, then with witnesses, and finally, if necessary, before the congregation. This is not about punishment but about restoration. The processing took several hours. As they worked, an officer entered the room with an update from the interrogation rooms. Pastor Harold is still denying most charges, the officer reported. But Reverend George broke down completely. He's been crying and saying he deserves to die. The officer hesitated, then continued. George has confessed. He says he and Harold, as church elders, deeply resented your father, Mr. Freeman, partly because of his race. This was the 1970s in rural Arkansas, but mainly because he threatened to expose their embezzlement of church